Welcome back, everyone. My new book, Positive Populism, is available for you to pre-order if you haven't already. There it is. You can head to positivepopulism.org to get it. One of the central ideas in it is decentralizing power, taking it out of the hands of the federal government and bureaucrats and giving it back to you, the people. One effort to do just that has been something that we've talked about here on this show, and it's in the book as well, the Convention of States. Joining me now, the president of the Convention of States Project, Mark Meckler. Mark, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. We've talked about this before on the show, but just in case some of our audience didn't catch that the first time around, I'd love you just to set out, as simply as you could, what is the Convention of States Project?
Sure. In Article 5 of the United States Constitution, the power for the people to get together state by state and call a convention, takes 34 states to do so, for the purpose specifically of restraining the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. It's set forth there in Article 5. The Convention of States Project is designed to use Article 5 of the Constitution to call a convention, to get delegates from all over the country together, to do just that, to propose amendments that would take away the power from the federal government and give it back to the people in the states as you described.
So that phrase, take it away and give it back to the people, that sounds great. A lot of people would agree with that. I certainly do. What specifically would that look like? What would be written in the amendments that would achieve that end?
Sure. Well, this application is done on what's called a subject matter basis. There are 3 subject matters that can be discussed at convention. The first is anything that would put fiscal restraints on the federal government. That would include things like a balanced budget amendment, imposing generally accepted accounting principles, imposing tax and spending caps on the federal government. The second area is anything that would impose term limits on the federal government. That would include both elected and appointed officials, so that would be Congress as well as the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court, and I think importantly the bureaucracy. And finally, the most important clause, I think, and the most important discussion that can be had is about taking power away from the federal government by restraining their scope or their jurisdiction. In other words, saying that there are things that the federal government may not be engaged in, for example, education and energy and the EPA, things like that.
But that's, okay, that's interesting. Again, I agree with that. But that's already in the Constitution. The 10th Amendment, that already, whatever, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's, the power's not explicitly given to the federal government, reserved for the states and the people. But that has been completely ignored. So how would this change? Education being a great example. Or healthcare is another one.
Well, I think
how would this change that?
I think you're hitting on the key point, which is when most of us think of the Constitution, Steve, we're thinking of maybe the pocket Constitution we carry around, the original one in the National Archives. Today, the Constitution, if you were to order it from the government printing office, and I have a copy sitting on my desk, it's 2,738 pages, not counting the more recent supplements. This is every Supreme Court case that has ever attempted to tell us what that Constitution actually means. I know you've read it. It's a fairly simple document. It's outrageous that it takes 2,700 pages of Supreme Court jurisprudence. And the reality is what they've done is dramatically expand the scope and the power of jurisdiction of the federal government. And the way the founders gave us to limit that, to carve back on what the Supreme Court has done, is Article 5.
I just want to really make sure we're all clear about that point. You're saying that the real agent behind the expansion of the federal government, or the enabler maybe is a better word, of the federal government's powers, has been the Supreme Court. Absolutely.
Let me give you a very specific example. In the 1930s, there was a case by the name of Wickard v. Filburn, and that case said, it ruled ultimately that a man who grew wheat for his own consumption was engaged in interstate commerce. Interstate commerce and the power to regulate that was given to the federal government is supposed to be very narrow, to regulate the movement of goods across state lines. Well, he engaged in no such commerce, but they said because he was growing wheat, he didn't buy wheat, so they could regulate him. In other words, business, not doing business, becomes business, and the federal government can regulate absolutely everything. That's an outrageous interpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Only an Article 5 convention can restrict that interpretation.
All right. Well, Mark, would you just stay with us, and we'll come back to you in a second. What do we think about this?
I hate it. I hate it. I absolutely think it's a disastrous. I don't believe that the Constitution is a living, breathing document that needs to just go to convention. Hey, let's go change the whole thing.
That's
I think
very dangerous.
It's a very dangerous way to go. When you talk about it from just a conservative viewpoint, hey, there's some conservative things that sound like it would be a good idea, but the put forth an amendment, the only way to do that is not through a convention of the states. You can also do that through Congress. But one of the things that these guys are talking about is reconfiguring the court, the Supreme Court, so that there's one from every state. They want 50 Supreme Court justices on a rotating basis. What could go wrong with that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think it sounds good in theory, but I think in practice it would be a disaster. Look at the difficulty that we have with our existing Constitution and our existing government. Everybody believes in deregulation, and everyone believes that the Supreme Court has, in some cases, overstepped its bounds. But I think the best way to combat that is exactly what this president is doing by deregulating. And also, look at the Supreme Court. We have an incredible opportunity. We were given one with Neil Gorsuch. We have another one coming up very shortly. So I think that's the best way to go about this. That sounds like an utter disaster. And would you like to see California try to do that? No.
Okay, let's go. I promised a heated debate. Let's have one. Mark, come back at them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would ask Jason and tell me if they understand who they're standing with. Every single radical, leftist, Marxist, communist group in America has stood against this. George Soros, Hillary Clinton personally has spoken out against this.
How about Senator Mike Lee? Senator Mike Lee's against it.
Hold on a second. Let me finish, Jason. Let me finish. And Jason, let me finish, and we'll finish. Over 250 radical groups, Planned Parenthood, La Raza, MoveOn.org, Common Cause, every leftist group, Hillary Clinton against this. If you look at people like Steve Hilton has spoken out in favor of it, Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck, Mark Levin, Randy Barnett from Princeton, or from... So all of these people, every major conservative figure in America, scholar or television personality has spoken out on it. Senator Tom Coburn
that's not true.
Okay,
let's just do it. Make sure everyone can hear. If you just hang on a second, Mark. Jason, you go with that point about the allies against this are not company you'd want to be in.
I just would argue that every single conservative person has spoken out on this. I disagree. I would point to my friend, former colleague.
I did not say that.
Mark. So, Mark, please.
I would point to, for instance, Senator Mike Lee. There are a lot of people out there that are opposed to this. It scares them. The idea that you don't know what the rules are going to be if you have one of these. And that's what's dangerous about this. I don't believe getting this group together to reconfigure the Constitution with some 20-plus amendments that are at least formalized in one degree or another out there is necessarily the recipe. And I appreciate that conservatives want to have more conservative judges and a more conservative approach, that the federal government is overreaching. I am totally on board, but I don't think a convention of the states is the right way to do it.
Tommy, and then last word to Mark.
No, I agree with Jason wholeheartedly. I think that it sounds great in theory. That's why many prominent conservatives have probably come out in favor of it, at least in part. I'm sure that's why, because deregulation sounds great to all of us, but in practice it sounds like a disaster, it sounds like a mess, and it sounds very dangerous. They mentioned all the leftist groups that are against it. It might not be because it's a conservative idea, it might just be because it's a bad idea, and we're all in agreement that it's a bad idea.
Sorry, Mark, very quickly, we don't have too much time. Just a quick final thought, please.
Very specifically, what all of these liberal groups have said is they fear that we will roll back 115 years of progressive gains. Mark Levin wrote an entire book on it. Senator Tom Coburn wrote an entire book on it. You guys are on the wrong side of history, and I would encourage you to stand with the founders who didn't act out of fear. They acted out of courage. Have the courage to stand.
All right, Mark, thank you so much. Great debate.
Sign the petition and get your friends and family to do the same. With your full address, your state legislators will know that you really are their constituents in their district. Our success depends on you. So we're inviting you to be part of history. Let's invoke the constitutional solution that's as big as the problem.